If you see something that's wrong, raise your hand and say that's wrong. Point it out and name that thing by name. Don't stand by and stare. If it's wrong, it's your affair. Don't be quiet, make a riot, be a pain. Be a pain, shout about it and complain. Ignore the crowd and go against the grain. Don't be polite, raise your voice and do what's right. Be a pain, be a pain, be a pain. When Rosa Parks sat on that bus, she chose to make a fuss. She chose to break the rules and take the blame. Her choice to sit and fight helped to bring on civil rights, because one strong woman chose to be a pain. Be a pain, shout about it and complain. If they say you have to move, say I'll remain. Don't sit polite, raise your voice and do what's right. Be a pain, be a pain, be a pain. Harvey Milk, he chose to run for the council board and won, even though folks said you can't because you're gay. One brave LGBTQ elected leader ran and knew you can change things if you choose to be a pain. Be a pain, shout about it and complain. Tell him I won't let you make me feel ashamed. Don't be polite, raise your voice and do what's right. Be a pain, be a pain, be a pain. Tennis star named Billie Jean told the world she had a dream that men and women would be paid the same. She refused to hit the ball till there was equal pay for all. She was a king because she was a royal pain. Be a pain, shout about it and complain. They refuse to pay, refuse to play the game. Don't be polite, raise your voice and do what's right. Be a pain, be a pain, be a pain. Kids from Parkland led the fight for something they knew was right. They said it's time to finally make a change. If adults can't compromise, we must go march for our lives. They spoke out and led the charge, they all were pains. Be a pain, shout about it and complain. When you're faced with laws you know are just insane. Don't be polite, raise your voice and do what's right. Be a pain, be a pain, be a pain. Sing along. Be a pain, shout about it and complain. Ignore the crowd and go against the grain. Don't be polite, raise your voice and do what's right. Be a pain, be a pain, be a pain. Be a pain, be a pain, be a pain. Be a pain, be a pain, be a pain.
Be a pain. Yes, my friends, let's be a pain. There have been times in our lives when we've all been a pain. And there's a little bit more colorful term that we usually use sometimes, but I'm not going to go that far this morning. But I heard this music originally several weeks ago because Mark Morgan, who used to be here a number of years ago, is in charge of our music program, and some of you will remember him from then. And he puts on a concert at Hancock United Church of Christ several times a year, particularly this past year where he's been doing it virtually. And the fellow that wrote this song is a friend of his by the name of Alistair Mock, who is a composer, singer, and a teacher. He spends a lot of times teaching kids about social justice issues. And he does it usually through songs, just as this song, Be a Pain. We've been a pain to each other. We've been a pain to our families sometimes. I think most of us, when we went through our teenage years, if we can remember those years, where we were a pain. We were a pain to our parents, you know, because we knew anything we said was right. Anything they said was wrong. But in our 20s, suddenly we probably woke up one day and said, you know, our parents were right. But today I want to center this pain on this topic of pain on what is going to be happening during Holy Week. Holy Week is a really interesting and sometimes challenging period as we move toward Easter. Easter is, in Christendom, the highest holy day that we have. Today, Jesus enters on a donkey. He comes in Jerusalem. This is the first time he's ever been to Jerusalem. He's been out the last 3 years in the provinces, in Galilee and all the smaller towns in that area. And now he's approaching Jerusalem. It's the time of Passover. There's a lot of people in the city. There's a lot of excitement as rumors begin to spread among some of the population that the Messiah is on the way. And as he approaches the city, he asks for a donkey and a colt. And he comes in on a donkey. And it's I can visualize this so well in my mind. He enters the gates, one of the 12 gates that are there in the city. And there are a few people around, but as word spreads, people begin to gather. And it is said in Matthew that a large crowd, well, we don't know how large a crowd. Scholars have been debating that for thousands of years because we don't know how they figured a crowd. But let's say it's a fairly good-sized crowd, and they're coming into the Jerusalem. This is the seat of power in all of this part of the world of Israel. As we might say in our modern language, this is where all the shakers and movers are. The Pharisees, this sect that believes in very strict adherence to the Torah, they're there and they have power. And they are expecting, the Jewish people have been expecting the Messiah for generations. And they pretty much, I think, visualized him as a king who is going to come among them and destroy the Roman government and free them so that they can become free citizens and worship as they want. But something different happens. He comes in on this donkey rather than a white horse as a conquering king. And a donkey represents servanthood. He comes in, and one of the first things he does is he goes into the temple and throws out the moneylenders and says, this is a place of prayer. This is what it's for. And that began the decline because he spends a week trying to defend himself and trying to tell people that he is a king in not the military aspects of what he is going to come among them preaching love and compassion. So as the week goes along, he's questioned intensively, and he's being a pain. He's been a pain for a long time. The Roman government, which is a couple of thousand miles away, I would expect by foot, maybe a little shorter by a boat, they've heard about him, but to them, he's just a pain in their side. He has, they feel like he has the potential of maybe really giving them a hard time and trying to seize power. Because at this time, there was a lot of messiahs running around saying that they are the chosen one, but none of them have been able to do anything for the people. And now this man comes in, kind of nondescript preaching, and he's preaching to whoever will listen to him. And that's what we come today. We start that journey that will end in the terrible hanging from the cross on Good Friday. And then on Sunday, Mary finds the tomb empty. And there's a resurrection, which symbolizes hope. So it's kind of an interesting week. He goes from being hailed as a hero to be condemned to death, and then he arises. So on this Sunday morning, as we prepare, we need to think about this being a pain. Jesus spent his entire ministry being a pain because he knew there were a better time ahead if people would just follow what he was doing, his examples. That's what the purpose of the disciples were. They were following him, learning it all the time, because they were expected, they may not know it at this point, to go out and spread the word. And that's the reason we're here, folks, this morning. This Palm Sunday, a time of joy. In the modern world, this song talks about a number of people that have been pains. Rosa Parks, Harvey White, Billie Jean King are just to name a few. And I think we can probably think of others. Personally, I think about Martin Luther King in Easter week of 1963. Martin Luther King was in the Birmingham jail. It was not a nice place to be. I lived in Birmingham for close to 3 years when I was a child. And one day I don't remember where we were going, but we passed the Birmingham jail in the 1950s. And it was a pretty sad place. So he was sitting there in that jail, and he wrote this letter primarily to the white pastors in Birmingham, because they had been asking him not to rattle the boat, essentially. You're going too fast. We can't expect people to follow the rules of integration this fast. Well, it was time that their minds were changed. And in this beautifully written letter, and if you haven't read it, I would suggest you go out on the internet and read it. It's beautifully written because he didn't attack them with a lot of vicious language. It was a very calmly, well thought out letter of why this was going on, because people were suffering. And in this Easter week, there was going to be suffering of our Lord. And how can these white pastors stand up there and talk about Jesus and love and compassion and the terrible acts of execution without looking at themselves and looking in the city of Birmingham and how many people were suffering? And they were mostly African Americans. There were white folks too that were in poverty. So this letter, to me, is a perfect example of being a pain. Martin Luther King was a pain. Since that day, and I think it was around 1956 when he went to Dexter Street, was called to Dexter Street Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. And he was fresh out of Boston University, recently married, children on the way or planned. And he was presented shortly after he arrived with a proposal from the, at that time called the Negro Business Association. They were tired of being discriminated on the buses in Montgomery. And Rosa Parks has finally lit the fuse of change. And after prayer and discussions with his wife and his friends, he took the position of heading this demonstration. And the vivid scene that I remember from his biography is he's standing in his kitchen before dawn on the day the boycott was going to start. And he was alone. He was in prayer. He was reflecting, thinking about the day and the consequences. And he said, as I poured a cup of coffee, my knees began to shake. And I almost couldn't, he said, I almost couldn't move. They were shaking so bad. Because he said in his biography, or it was written in his biography, that he knew that this could lead to a lot of hatred, frustration, people being assaulted, and even his death. But he felt like he had to do it because he was called by God to do it and to minister to his people who were suffering. This is a great example, again, of a pain person being a pain. In our own lives, we've had times when we've had to be a pain. As I said, in our teenage years, we probably were a pain, but the one that I see in my work is people trying to make decisions about end of life. And sometimes they have to make decisions that are not exactly what other family members may want, nor the patient wants, but whoever is in charge of the care has to be a pain sometimes for the betterment of the patient. Can't tell you how many family meetings I've sat through where perhaps mom or dad is incapacitated and the child or maybe one of the sons or daughters is the caregiver and has control of the proxy and end of life papers and so forth. And there's no direction. And there hasn't been any kind of DNR signed or any other paperwork. And they're trying to make a decision what to do, maybe to bring them off a ventilator. And as the doctors express, probably a very short lifespan, but there's nothing else they can do. So it's a busy time and it's a very tough time because you may have family members taking sides. But ultimately, this person, and they are the only ones that can do it, has to make that decision. And sometimes they're a pain. And sometimes feelings will be hurt for a long time. But you've got to think about the patient and not each other and what's best for them. We also have other examples in our lives. I think the one thing that I've heard most often from people that have had to give up driving, it's probably the worst decision they have to make. And sometimes they don't want to make it. And maybe the kids will get involved and say, you know, you've got to give up your driving. You're not capable anymore. You had a slight accident last week, which indicates, you know, that you need to to sit down and think about this, and ultimately you have to do. We'll have to support you that way. So that's a very tough time. And then, the children are seen as, a pain. In our church life, we've seen any number of examples where we've had to stand up and be right. I can think of back in the early 90s, this church was trying to build what now is Fellowship Hall. This had been going on for about the last 20 years with a lot of infighting, a lot of hurt feelings, but finally, leadership said, we've got to have this space. We need it. And they stood up and said, we know some of you don't want to finance it. You don't think it's time for it, but we do. And this is what we're going to do. And we had several votes and several tense meetings, but ultimately we built that building. And now it, is under constant use. Not the last year it hadn't been because of the pandemic, but prior to that, any number of people were using that fellowship hall, church as well as non-church folks. So we have had to do that. And we've had other issues that have come before us that sometimes we've had to be a pain. So in today's world, there is so much going on. We're facing coming out of this pandemic. And what are we going to do when we do return to church and be in our meeting house, having time to be with each other, talk, laugh, maybe even cry a little bit. But to get there, there are certain things that we have to go through. And I'm confident we will. But the other thing is we step away from wearing masks and social distancing. It's going to take time because we're going to come out of it, I'm sure, and we're going to be a little apprehensive. And we may be a pain in the butt trying to resolve any of our issues or any of our concerns. There are going to be people that are going to want to still wear a mask, even after we take them off. And that's their right. And people will become probably a pain in the butt about that. Excuse me for my language there. But so here we are. We're starting Easter week, a week of high hopes, ending with that wonderful, happy Easter on Easter morning. And as we approach that, I would ask that we all think about what Jesus had to do to get us there, being a pain. So I also ask us, as we journey on our faith journey, that sometimes we have to be a pain in the butt. Excuse me, I'm using this term. It's so much a part of I guess, who I am. So I apologize if that upsets anybody. But here we are again. So in closing, I'd like to say, are you going to be a pain? Are you going to be a pain for Christ? Amen.